Hi, I'm Mark Tyrrell of Uncommon Knowledge, and I want to discuss what I feel is wrong with the way we treat much mental illness today and how we can all make a difference in beginning to change things. It seems like nowadays everything is about science and technology, and in many ways I think that's great. For one thing, it's empowered us at Uncommon Knowledge to reach millions of people. However, because we humans are prone to tarring everything with the same brush, I believe this drive has seriously damaged our ability to deal with mental health problems. So the wisdom that was once contained within our communities is being lost. In the West, at least, I think the humanity is being systematized out of psychological help. People are being treated more and more like machines. I think that the reason for this is that that a certain tendency of the human mind has gained the upper hand. And to illustrate what I mean, I'd like to tell an ancient story that shows the knowledge of this tendency has been around for a long time. The story is called The Thirsty King. So once there was a hugely powerful king who one day found that he had become horribly thirsty. But he lived in a land and a time when the true cause of thirst was not properly understood. All the king knew was that his throat was dry, and so he bellowed out to his servants, "My throat is dry, I have this terrible thirst, help me." And his servants, wanting to curry favour with their ruler, dashed about finding things to cure his condition. At first they brought him some lubricating oil, the type you might use in a car engine, and the king eagerly grabbed at the oil, understanding that some kind of liquid might ease or even cure his condition. So he swigged down the oil, but then he found he had other problems. Now he had this horrible taste in his mouth from the oil, and now his tongue felt strange. That said, these new symptoms did distract him from the thirst for a little while. He told his doctor of his symptoms, and the royal doctor, being an expert on such matters, immediately gave him some pickled onions and some vinegar to cure the symptoms of the supposed cures his servants had given him for his thirst. The king felt momentarily relieved and desperately consumed the pickled onions and vinegar, but almost immediately found his eyes began to water and he developed a terrible stomachache. So to soothe the stomachache, our poor king was prescribed scented syrupy wine with just a little salt, which he drank down as advised. He soon found that despite the initial relief, he now felt nauseous, his digestion was ruined, and his thirst was now raging like a bushfire in summer. As luck would have it, about this time a wise woman was passing the palace gates and heard the commotion. Speaking to the gate guards, she persuaded them to bring her to the king, and in front of his esteemed medical advisors, she suggested that perhaps what the king originally needed, and still in fact needed, was just water. So there was, perhaps predictably, a stunned silence. Then everyone, the courtiers, the doctor, the servants, the experts, all became very angry with the wise woman. After all, how could such an increasingly complex disorder just be down to thirst? After all, had not the king had the best and most expensive treatments known to humanity? They ran the wise woman out of town, who reflected that perhaps she hadn't been so wise in challenging their cherished beliefs so directly. And that was how the wise people became known as the idiots in a time less enlightened than our own, of course. Despite it being probably over 1,000 years old, I think the essence of this story has never been truer than it is today. Now we can dismiss that as a silly story full of really dumb people, or we can actually use it to provide a pattern for what seems to be happening in the world right now. The king, of course, represents not just one person, but millions. And now I want to tell you about the true case of Carolyn, a lady who we helped some years ago. If you look on the Uncommon Knowledge YouTube channel, you can watch her husband talking about his and her harrowing experiences. Sadly, their story is one I've heard in slightly different forms hundreds of times. And you may have heard their story or even thought it applied to you at some point. The case of Carolyn is in a way the same story as I've just told about the Thirsty King. Carolyn had become very anxious and depressed, and her fears were triggered by the 2005 London bombings. Carolyn constantly watched the news and was very concerned, not to say terrified, about the possibility of troops going into Pakistan, where her daughter was about to visit. As time passed, she became more and more worried over what would normally seem like trivial matters, such as not having enough clean clothes or worrying about whether she'd be late for an appointment in 3 days' time. Carolyn became severely depressed and slept a lot, hardly ever getting up and certainly not participating in life like she used to. She worried and spent much of her time in her own head in a negative way. And she eventually started to have psychotic episodes here and there, divorced from reality, worrying about things like losing all her teeth. Worries tend to produce yet more worries, and pretty soon all her worrying, which had originated with the London bombings, had totally exhausted Carolyn. Eventually, she had a complete breakdown while trying to cook and had to be taken to hospital. And sadly, this was not the end of Carolyn's problems, but the start of more to come. The psychiatric team charged with caring for Carolyn immediately put her on so much medication she became, according to her husband, even worse than she'd been before. At this point, Carolyn became suicidal, had the shakes so badly she could barely stand, and was losing her balance. She couldn't focus on anything, she couldn't do simple tasks or keep up properly in a conversation. And her husband Malcolm was particularly saddened to see that she'd become dead behind the eyes. Her eyes were so glazed that, in his words, it was like she'd had a lobotomy. And Carolyn reached the point where she was given strong drug products to help her manage the side effects of other strong drug products, drugs to manage the effects of drugs. She was so dazed on her medication, and she walked out in front of a car and was hit by it and had to be hospitalized. So eventually Malcolm realized he'd rather she was ill off the medication than ill on it. And as an engineer, he had a very practical mind and did some research into the drugs that she was on and devised a detailed and complicated withdrawal program to minimize the withdrawal effects. As Carolyn withdrew, she worked with an uncommon knowledge therapist who had great success at calming her down and giving her audio tapes to listen to in order to relax her. The knowledge that Carolyn and her husband learned about depression and the cycle of depression, how it made the brain think, was invaluable because they were learning what depression was doing to her and how to stop it. Knowledge, as they say, is power. By the way, you can learn about the cycle of depression at our website www.clinical-depression.co.uk. Malcolm's withdrawal documentation is also available on that site. Now, years later, Carolyn is living life to the full. She is still off all medication, although she takes some herbal remedies. And not surprisingly, her doctor is extremely interested in the progress that she's made. Now, it's important to remember that not everyone has the same wonderfully supportive and capable husband or partner as Carolyn has, or has access to a well-trained therapist who can spot thirst when he sees it or when she sees it and knows what to do. But I'm sure you've noticed by now that this true story was essentially the same as the pattern contained in the ancient Thirsty King tale. And so we see that this tendency to overcomplicate and the inability to see the wood for the trees is a human trait that was identified a long, long time ago by the first teller of the tale of the Thirsty King. All the best stories are true in the sense that they cast light and understanding on how human traits and patterns of behavior and belief proliferate in the world. So in the first story, the courtiers to the king were like the professionals to Carolyn, who diagnosed all kinds of mental disorders and depression and so forth, and tried to fix it with drugs that made her feel worse. The products they prescribed caused other symptoms for Carolyn, for which in turn she was prescribed yet more drugs to cope with drugs. And somewhere within all that chemical prescription, she lost, or almost lost, herself and a sense of what she really needed. Now, I need to make it clear that I'm not anti-medication for when it's really needed. We're anti-complication. We're against the idea that people in general are broken and need medication to fix them. So pathologizing and medicalizing people's natural reactions to tough life circumstances can cause greater problems, just as prescribing vinegar and onions to the king made him even thirstier. The king was pleased for a while because he felt like something was being done for him, but ultimately he ended up much worse off. He trusted his advisors, had faith in them, and everyone around him did too. Psychological distress, just like physical thirst, is a signal that the sufferer needs something from life that they're currently not getting. Whether it's reassurance, rest, company, meaning, love and support, the need to feel connected, safe and strong, these needs are not met through pharmacology. If Carolyn had received the right help at the point she began worrying about her daughter's upcoming trip to Pakistan, if the king had been given water as soon as he became thirsty, life would have been easier for both of them. When it comes to psychology, what uncommon knowledge stands for is common sense, research into what helps people overcome problems and thrive, traditional wisdom and teaching people about how to use their built-in abilities to heal. In 1996, my co-founder Roger Elliott and I started Uncommon Knowledge by running workshops for the public on how to help themselves overcome problems and perform at their best. We've been doing that for a couple of years when the people who were coming along started to change. They became very varied. We got lay people simply interested in the mind. We got those wanting help in their lives, but we also started getting doctors, GPs, counselors, psychologists and psychotherapists hoping to find better tools for helping people. And at first, I have to say, we were overawed by the people we considered to be the experts, the real experts, who came to our workshops. Surely medical doctors, psychiatrists and psychologists knew more about helping people than we did, even if we did get good results. But over time, we noticed there was no common consensus on what people actually need to thrive rather than just survive in their lives, what actually makes people happy and healthy. There was no agreement amongst all these people as to what real thirst was. And that's what we made our focus. You probably know that there are more people on prescribed medication than ever before, yet rates of unhappiness have never been higher. Despite all these so-called medical advancements and increasingly complex lists of diagnoses, people aren't getting any happier, quite the opposite in fact. And of course, receiving a diagnosis may feel like a relief at first. It can also be disempowering if inherent within the diagnosis is the belief that the person with the label is stuck with it for life. Life is in danger of being reduced to a pathological wasteland in which everyone is seen as sick and broken. Imagine a world in which we really didn't know what caused thirst or hunger. Imagine a world in which thirst and hunger weren't alleviated through drink and food, but through professional theorizing and scary-sounding diagnosis and expensive drug treatments, which needed more drugs to fix the effects of those drugs. A psychiatrist I know said to me recently, it's like some of us want to deal with a condition by treating it with drugs, but not look at the person behind the condition, with all their very human needs and wants. So it's something about the way we're living that is tipping increasing numbers of people over the brink, and something about the way we're treating these conditions isn't working, and I suspect making things even worse. So here's a way of looking at it that might help. People are thirsty. Giving them onions and vinegar is not going to help and can make them a lot worse. If there is a taboo against saying this, then it's time we broke that taboo and moved on. It's safe to say that both society and treatment need to change. Some medication for some people for short periods of time may help people cope for a while. A minority of people are born with conditions which may need medicating. But at Uncommon Knowledge, we're passionate about curing the thirst. When we train therapists in our online classroom, Uncommon You, we teach them to look for what's missing in people's lives and how to help them help people meet their needs. How to feel calm and overcome damaging and traumatic memories, how to cope and thrive in relationships of all kinds. And if we can cure those kinds of thirsts, then perhaps the person can stay clear of onions and syrup and vinegar and hospitalization and drugs for the drugs. Through our articles, courses and products, we aim to teach people how they can help themselves, their families and friends, and ultimately their communities become happier, healthier, And if you're a practitioner, I hope you'll subscribe to our newsletter, Clear Thinking, to learn a little more about how we approach things, and that we'll see you on a course with our other uncommon practitioners sometime soon. And I hope that you will take some uncommon knowledge back into your community and help us continue this work. Thanks for watching.